I have written a lot about Twitter in the recent weeks. Actually, I did at the New York Times too. And some may ask, well, why is an environment reporter focused on this stuff? And to me, it's pretty clear that the information environment that we live in now is substantially, for better or worse, going to change the real environment. This is not a new thing, by the way. More than 100 years ago, the extinction of the passenger pigeon was abetted by communication technology. The telegraph, there were people telegraphing, the birds are in back east, and people would get on trains and go out and hunt and with their rifles, their shotguns, and that helped to destroy the passenger pigeon. So technology, that time it was telegraph, but it just shows you that the tools we have now are just like those then. They can be used for good or for ill. You know, the information environment, as I said, is really an influential part of the biogeophysical environment going forward. And Darwin actually weirdly foresaw some of this in 1871 in his book, The Descent of Man. He said, you know, as we advance in civilization, our tribal nature will be less and less, will be more connected. He actually in this book went on to say how we're connecting with nature, with other species more this way. But he said there's only an artificial barrier to prevent the sympathies extending to men of all nations and races. And, you know, again, technology in theory has given us that capacity to truly be the global village that some envisioned many decades ago. Again, the shows I do are split between looking at actual climate policy, climate science, and other issues, and this question. I did one recently: can the public value of Twitter be sustained there or elsewhere? And that's where we're at today. It's a Twitter engineer. He just quit 2 weeks ago, who I had on my show. He explained, even as he's leaving, how much he loves it, and that it took 10 years of nonstop programming, regulatory work, and other work to create this thing we now know of as Twitter. So don't count on any of the competitors to be able to jump in to take that place anytime soon. If you step back and look at this from 2007 through 2037, could this be a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Twitter, you know, it's made the need for a public real-time channel like this very obvious. And who knows what will happen with Twitter over the next year or so. But I would have to think that if Twitter moves away from providing that for whatever reason, that something will fill that void. But at the same time, you know, building Twitter was a decade effort. And there's just so much complexity behind it in terms of privacy, in terms of privacy regulations, you know, just the plumbing involved is amazing. And the fact that it's so fast and so public and global. I don't want to, I have no idea like how hard would that be to rewrite from scratch, but it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, the engineers I worked with to a T were all super smart and motivated and proud of what they had built. So, but it's not to say that some other service could pop up that provides those characteristics, those features.
So this is his domain. Jim Moffat, the guy who's just left Twitter, who I had on the show recently and wrote about, he's there using the data. We're going to talk about all the ways we can use the tool directly, but it's worth just touching on this too. As a data portal, Twitter is amazing. 6,000 tweets a second. So when the flood is unfolding in Jakarta or in Texas, they're good bots. Not all bots are bad, that are automatically feeding data into the system to help authorities or emergency response agencies be more effective at and all of us at understanding where flood peril lies and the like. So that's, and of course, as I've indicated here too, there's Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center. All around the world, the data are being used, and input from the public is being used to inform and make more efficient how we deal with emergencies. Yeah, we had this discussion of in Jakarta, you'll be able to see if you review this later, how reports from citizens through this app that now there's a very high buy-in on Twitter in Indonesia. And as people are tweeting about the flooding in different parts of this giant city, that again builds a picture of what's going on. It's fantastic. So I got this graphic from one of those sort of motivational business entrepreneurship websites, making the most of things. It's mission, objective, strategy, tactics. I'd add tools. Of course, Twitter is a tool. What do you want to get out of the online part of your life? And so I hope right now, just quickly, when you think of what you're here for, you're here online right now, and obviously you're motivated to think about how to make the most of the internet and connectivity. Maybe pop into the chat as we go forward some of the things you're thinking about. What is in one word or two? Are you looking for connection? Are you looking for answers? Are you looking for partners? Let me know. We can talk about that in the second half of this talk. Twitter says, this is from their page, Twitter is what's happening and what people are talking about right now. And again, it's an open system. It's not like Facebook, where you have to be part of Facebook to go into that arena and connect with other people, for better or worse. To me, the big difference between the other web portals and Twitter is that it's people, and it's revealed here by search. I did I chose two terms. It's maybe one or two of you think about the Arctic and about aerosols, pollution flowing to the Arctic, not just CO2 and affecting the climate, or aerosols from wildfires. So plug those two terms into Google and you get one set of results. Plug those two terms into Twitter as a search engine and you get a completely different thing. You get people instead of things or ideas. Here's just Google is papers and the like, and Twitter is John Christensen, who's a writer at UCLA, who's very involved in sustainability, and Andreas Baccarini, who's very involved in aerosols. That you could take any two or three terms, and I guarantee you on one part of the internet, if you search for them there, you'll find stuff, you'll find papers, you'll find organizations. On the other, you'll find people who are involved in inquiry on that question. So that's the big first difference, I think. I'd like you to also, as you're thinking about what you want to get out of online connectivity, also put into the chat, think just for a second, who have you met? Who have you been encountered? Who have you been engaged with recently in your work, your career, or your life track, who you met through Twitter, if you're on Twitter, and who you wouldn't have met otherwise? And just think about that, what that's enabled. I know, for example, Katindi Sivi, who's a futurist in Nairobi. She's been on my show a number of times. She's working on a program to give kids in Africa, across Africa, not just in Kenya, the capacity to plan ahead, to think like a futurist. And the only reason I know about her is Twitter. And she's one of hundreds for me of sources and guides, and also partners, collaborators, who I would not know exist if it weren't for this platform. One reason, that's a practical reason to think about Twitter seriously, is it's where the journalists are. It's also where politicians are. Every politician now has a Twitter account. So if you tag a politician in something, if you're writing about, if your work relates to lobster conservation in Maine, lobster harvest and right whales, and you want to make sure Maine politicians know what you're thinking, tagging them will pretty much guarantee someone in their office will get a look at them. But journalists are here in droves. There are some portals journalists are moving to. I am among them. I'm set up at post.news, but Twitter is still the domain for where the media hang out. Sam Montano, who's at Mass Maritime Academy, she's a professor. She teaches emergency management. She's a dynamo. She's on Twitter. She's on TikTok. And she's doing great work, public outreach, and also in the sort of outreach to policymakers and to the media. During COVID, she was posting about how FEMA resources were not being applied to the COVID crisis that could be. And as she wrote recently in one of her on her newsletter at Substack, she recounted how she ended up on Chris Hayes's show at MSNBC because of her tweets. Here's one example. So this is May 2020 update to this. Chris Hayes covered this story on MSNBC last night. EMG Twitter is a hashtag with the emergency management community on Twitter. Informal way to have a common view of this flow of information to cut through all this stuff. And he replied in part because of your tweets. So, being there is a way to engage with journalists for mostly for better. And this can have multiple benefits. It's not just getting your story to the journalists, but here, for example, is a case where Reuters, in early 2021, there was this Reuters hot list. I think there was one or two Columbia scientists who might have been on it. It was like the 1,000 most influential climate scientists. Mike Oppenheimer at Princeton was high on the list. He was profiled by Reuters. And the community of climate-oriented scientists in sub-Saharan Africa took note of the fact that there was hardly anyone from the global south in this list. And of course, that's because the West, the North, has had a half-century head start in being leaders in the science on global warming. It's mostly white Northern guys, and the list reflected that. And so through Twitter, the Conversation, which is a website where lots of scientists write, I've done webcasts with the people who run it. They pointed to their article on the Conversation, the African publication, the African edition, and they got a lot of attention from me and others in terms of saying, hey, Reuters, can we reimagine how you think about who's valuable to the world community as climate change rolls out? So it levels the playing field and makes the media more responsive. It will, I guarantee you. Reuters won't do something like that again without being much more without much more circumspection about who should be on such a list. It makes the media more responsive, but only if you engage, only if you're there, only if you, the community of people who care about making progress on the planet through communication, are there. There's so many. I'm just going to tick down some of the reasons, historically, some of the ways it's been utilized. I've interacted with, when I was at Pace University from 2010 through 2016, I taught a course called Blogging a Better Planet. We had a hashtag Pace blog, and the students were all creating blogs with some facet of what they were working on was about how to make the world better through your whatever it is you're interested in. So Pace blog was our class hashtag. Bird class is my favorite one. I'm not sure if, again, this is Keynote. I haven't used it before. Normally I could click a link and open the website, but I'll do that later. Margaret Rubega, who I started writing about at the New York Times because of her tweeting, of her integrating Twitter into her teaching through the hashtag Bird class, is fantastic, a fantastic leader in that. And also just in thinking forward about what Twitter is about now and where this, if you think about Twitter as a capacity more than a specific entity, where we go from here. So this can spill your classroom learning out into the world, spill the world into your classroom. It's a fantastic tool for that. Another reason, I know many of you, some of you probably have some of these socks or stockings or ties. The warming stripes created by Ed Hawkins primarily some years ago have become a symbol of climate awareness. It's a historical record of climate change, temperature told through color. And it's largely emerged because of Twitter. Especially Twitter is a crossroads for collaborative creativity. Ed Hawkins in the UK, he was posting on Twitter a lot of his variations of this warming trend through color. And then Alex Radke, who's an engineer in Germany, not a climate scientist, said, this is interesting, but one of the problems with the warming stripes is they go from like 150 years ago until now, but they don't really inform where do we go from here? And he started posting iterations of the stripes, and together they've been collaborating on this. I had them both on one of my webcasts. It was the first time they'd actually met face to face, like through a screen, but face to face. And we had a great discussion of how that happened and how we can foster more of that capacity for, again, multiple geographies, across language, across culture, taking some question like, how do we use color to drive understanding and awareness and action around mitigating warming? Another use of Twitter is to ask questions. You have to build a network to some extent to do that. So the more you have your community, the better, but you don't want the community to be too tight. One thing I worry about on Mastodon, for example, and we can talk about more about Mastodon, is that it's kind of self-organizing clusters of disciplines who already know each other are creating these little islands on Mastodon, and they're linked. But there's really constraints on how much crosstalk there can happen, or how much discovery can happen, where someone comes along and says, like Alex Radke says, well, what about the stripes going forward? Once you build a bit of a community there, then you start to ask questions. David Roberts, who's a journalist, he's a big part of climate and energy Twitter. A couple of years ago, he could post pretty specific, tough questions that they're not of great interest to the wider Twitter community. They're not, there to get attention per se. They're there to answer a question. Sam Montano, again, this is just a couple of days ago, November 29th. Have any emergency management agencies made it onto TikTok yet? Sam is also on TikTok, and she's just getting going there on TikTok, trying to understand, it's the fastest growing visual platform by far, beating Instagram and everything. And Elena Woods is a geographer focused on climate who's become a bit of a star on TikTok. So Sam asked this question, and right away there was an answer below from Leah Barton Kim, who says Reddy Harris, which I think is Harris, Pennsylvania, was there. And then Madison County EMA kicked in right away. We are in the building, have been for a while, give us a follow. So you can ask and answer questions as a way to build community and refine what you're thinking and what others are thinking. But threads are really a valuable way as a scholar, scientist, or a student with some project that's done to build content on Twitter that can really, it's like a story. It's like publishing. It's a publishing platform just as much as a blog, but it's sitting there in searchable Twitter space, so that if it's about sea life in the garbage patch and someone's out there searching for ocean plastic, whatever, they'll find it. This fantastic young journalist, Michael Thomas, has mastered the art of Twitter threads. He's had thousands of shares and reads of his stories. Again, he was kind of like many really good reporters who are out there doing good work, but it's hard to get elevated by creating these clever, drama-driven, sort of like this first tweet suggests something that leads you to the next. He's built a great following. His opening was, all across the country, local governments are restricting and banning clean energy projects. I heard rumors that misinformation on Facebook was a major cause of this, so I joined 40 anti-wind and solar groups to see some of it for myself. The results were bleak. And he takes you through that learning. The great Rebecca Helm, who's a fantastic ocean scientist, did this spectacular thread full of dynamic moving images. And I'll show you in a few minutes. OMG, it literally took some swimming from Hawaii to California to discover this. But wow, did we find something shocking in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. So threads are a way to get intrigue and storytelling into the Twitter space in ways that can fit in those little 280 character boxes. Through all this, you want to protect yourself, obviously. Twitter can be incredibly toxic, particularly for women and people of color and other than the traditional gender. And there are tactics and tools and community building practices that can let you be in Twitter, get the best of it without being harassed and dangerously exposed and the like. We did a couple of webcasts on this early on. I can send links to anyone to them. We did them with Pan America, which is a group that so more than 100 years old that supports writers around the country and the world. And Pan America also has a sort of an anti-harassment toolkit that they're now sharing increasingly with scientists and scholars, and we connected with them to do some training around that. There are other ways within Twitter to shield yourself from the full body of what can be weird, overwhelmingly variegated and a mix of harmful and helpful people. There are tools within Twitter that aren't generally. I'd say the awareness of them is pretty low. I'm not using them that much myself, but they're there. There are communities. So if you go to your Twitter account, if you have one, there that whole little strip at the left-hand side that has where you can create lists or the like. There are also communities. You can create a community. It's similar to like a Slack group. So you can create subunits within Twitter where the content only goes to those within that group. There are all these levels through which you can limit who can see the stuff you're posting, conversations you're having. And here's one that was created by Eric Holthaus, who was a Columbia grad, meteorologist, super tweeter, who is trying to build one of the alternatives to Twitter right now. It's brand new. Twitter circles are similar, and I just think I encourage you to dig in on each of those little boxes, and there are links I can send to the really good background that Twitter itself has. They have a whole long tutorial on how to use all these entities and why. One of the points I try to stress is I think social media is almost set up to have you sit back and experience it as it's coming at you, as distinct from going into it with a purpose and using it. It's very easy to get sucked down rabbit holes. I do it all the time. So going in with purpose, making sure you're there on a particular day, a particular hour with something in mind, is a good way to do this. Glenn Peters, who's a fantastic scientist over in Europe, who's tracking carbon policy and emissions trends and the like, he posted just today. Many have noted that the Twitter timeline and activity levels have changed. Have people stopped tweeting, or has the timeline changed? He's wondering if Musk algorithms are shifting. Ukraine tweets are gone. Oliver Gieden, who's an economist, another great policy wonk in Germany, replied to him a little bit critically. This only happens to the lazy people who use the AI curated timeline. Just use latest tweets and all those problems disappear, and there's more insights there. And I'll be sharing the slides later too. Yeah, and they're right. Again, if you look carefully at your Twitter home base, at the top right-hand corner, there's a option tool to go from latest tweets to what's happening, which is more tuned algorithmically. So there's lots of ways to fine-tune your experience to be useful to you. I use Twitter lists. I still haven't tracked back who this was. Maybe 10 months ago, I noticed someone had commented that if you're overwhelmed by your feed, if you're feeling it's too toxic or too off the point or too much about K-pop or maybe the World Cup, depending on what you're thinking about on a particular day, create a list. I have a bunch of lists created in my Twitter account. There's one, Sustain What, which is mostly scholars and scientists digging in on big sustainability questions. Suscomers is communicators, mostly journalists. COVID-19 sanity seekers is what you think. Conflict solution seekers was mainly around Ukraine. Sustain Maine is people working here in the state I now live in to foster better forestry, ocean practices, science related to marine change and climate change and the like. So lists can be a way to avoid that, the passive idea of just looking at your feed, excuse me, and switching it to an active filtering. Now, you don't want to be too filtered, because that really takes you into the bubble that is not a good place to be in a variegated world. Always, gauge progress. Use the analytics. I'll again, when I get off of the presentation, I'll try to show some of these things. Analytics is very valuable, and it shows you also if you feel like you're not getting a lot of responses to your tweets. If you look at the back end, you can see how many visits they've got, or the engagement there. That's not someone liking it or replying to it or retweeting it. Quite often there can be quite a lot of engagement that's just people coming and looking, being quiet, and we miss those voices because they're not there, but they're significant. You don't have to worry too much about numbers. I focus more on quality and knowing that people are there, not necessarily commenting, is reassuring to me, because sometimes the comments can be non-constructive, and that's not limited to Twitter. When I was blogging at the New York Times, if you get too focused on what people who have the time and passion to post a comment, if you're too focused on their input, you're missing that body of people who are just coming to learn and moving on. So, here's a summary of some of the ways that Twitter is useful, or some of the ways to utilize it. That could be, again, fill in the blanks in your needs. You can lurk and learn. You can jump in with input. Share the wonder, I think, I do this quite often, photographs and video clips from where I live that are relevant to the questions I pursue. I think are important to put in there, and sharing other people's wonder is great. Inquiry, again, it's people, not organizations. If you're looking to understand an issue you're working on for a PhD, or in your postdoc work, or in thinking about a grant you might be writing that you'd want to related to West African precipitation trends, and you're not familiar enough with people working on that problem in West Africa, it's a great way to connect with them. One bit of advice is critiquing. There's ways to critique and reply that are not trolly, that are constructive, and there's ways to do it that could become more contentious and just lead to the sort of the heat of Twitter, which is not necessarily very productive. So thinking about how you approach criticism or constructive engagement is important. It really is a neural network. Ultimately, stepping back and having a look once in a while. But again, using search more than just the feed, I think, is really useful. It's the reliance on the feed is what I think has tended to lead people to in a hyper distilled sense that it's broken, and to miss the reality that's hugely useful on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis. I wrote, this is a piece I wrote back November 3rd. That's a little tongue-in-cheek, but in a way, all hail Elon Musk, the greatest spur to social media innovation ever. Should have a question mark, perhaps. But I think in a way he has done a kind of a service by shaking things up sufficient that websites like Mastodon, Post.news, Reddit, other places are now being actively assessed as something that can take on some of the properties and qualities that Twitter has evolved over since 2006, 2007. It's going to be a long time until anything makes the jump to being the real-time, global, open searchable discovery engine that Twitter is, underneath that harrowing surface sometimes. But I think in a way that we're at a good moment here, really, if we put it to the right kind of use. So a Twitter circle is just a smaller group within Twitter that you can create and post to. And that's something I think is useful. That's not something everyone is automatically attuned to know that's there. Communities, again, here's one that was created by Eric Holthaus, who was a Columbia grad, meteorologist, super tweeter, who is trying to build a one of the alternatives to Twitter right now. It's brand new. Amy Stanfield, what is your response to the increase in hate crime and racist speech due to Musk's dismantling of the Trust and Safety Department responsibilities? These are big issues. Let me put that on screen so people can see. They're really big issues. When a billionaire who's hugely a maverick and who's politically at the edge of at one edge of things takes over a system like this, there are enormous ramifications for, as Amy's point here specifies. When I think about, do you just bail out or do you stick with it? I think the more that we bail out, the more Twitter will likely head toward the darker side of things.
For people who are on the webinar who are interested in learning about maybe approaches to Twitter or sharing their messages on Twitter, do you have a way that you think about writing a tweet before you put it out there? Or is there something you think about that would help the attendees understand your approach to writing something on Twitter?
So way back in May, when Elon Musk was first, it was looking like he was going to get Twitter, I wrote this piece, which is really the heart of what we're talking about today, to my mind. Here's how you can own Twitter. And some of the examples I pulled together are just exactly what Joey was talking about. So it's an engagement pathway. Jacqueline Gill here at the University of Maine, who I only know about because of Twitter, as a journalist, stumbled into her 4, 5, 6 years ago. She has a wonderfully refined capacity. She has an amazing capacity to engage people with the fruits of curiosity and open learning. So she tweets about everything, including the issues related to young academics have to deal with. But here, as I was getting out of my car today, I noticed a small yellow lump of pollen on the windshield. But which tree? So she started to do a little bit of a poke and see. There's the pollen. Here's her toolkit. She did a little bit of inquiry. And along the way, if you look at some of the responses, these are all getting multiple retweets and likes, including from biologists who are more dug in on pollen. So she's like, here she's kind of built a little bit of a learning journey, which is entirely reflecting what science is all about. I mean, she's a paleoecologist, and her work largely focuses on pollen, paleopollen. But I love the way she could take her own experience and build it forward into engagement with audiences. Twitter,
it's a nice example of sort of taking your own curiosity and the science that that the person is studying and making it accessible for the average person out there. And do you find in the scientists that you follow and journalists that you see that as something that is quickly responded to, that people react to, or do you think that it's sort of everybody finds their own voice?
I think it depends. Not everyone should or can do this, but it's one way to use Twitter. And there are people at Lamont and elsewhere who've done similar work. I think institutionally, if we are better at sharing when someone has done a creative tweet here at Columbia, at the climate school, then it's more apt for us to all as a community help to drive that forward as well. So that's one thing that we could do internally, is have a system for saying so-and-so just really did a creative tweet from the Lamont facility down on the pier in Piermont. Here it is. Let's get it out there. That would be useful. There's a lot of work here that can be done that way.
Yeah, and Lauren Esposito just posted, if you want to look at her comment. She had some good suggestions as well.
Yeah, let me, when I write a tweet, I always try to research the hashtag and include one or two in each post. I also try to tag individuals wherever possible. I try to use words that create a question, wonder, or are conversational in nature. Yeah, yeah. So this is the woman I was talking about earlier, Rebecca Helm. So this is this from Hawaii to California. It was a transect done where someone was swimming, but they also did science along the route. Here she has, wonderful examples, visual examples of what's going on. A link to the paper. So here's the paper for those who want to go deeper. But an incredibly shareable sequence here that mixes the science and the wonder. The crew took samples. Here's some of the samples, some of the organisms. Visual, moving visuals tend to capture people's attention. There's a good example.
So that's actually a good question, Andy. For Twitter, and each social platform has a different personality for what works and what doesn't work. And Instagram is clearly all photos. What do you think about Twitter and visuals and digital assets?
I think this is where the analytics comes in handy.
Mm-hmm.
It's been pretty clear that if you have an image or you clip an image and put it into a tweet, you can generate a lot more attention. I encourage people to get into the analytics for sure, because you can actually do A/B tests. You could do a tweet with and without a picture. You can see the results in the back end. I found it's useful as a journalist, and I think in the sciences too. If you're in your own discipline, if you're kind of stuck, you can use Twitter to examine, to widen your view. In 2020, I saw someone had posted an article about Forbes, 50 leading female futurists. Really interesting, because when my impression, if you look at the world online, the futurists who come to mind are people like Steven Pinker, those sort of guys, or Taleb, the guy who wrote the Black Swan book. And so I started to get more focused on this. I was really interested, do female futurists tend to have different, are their analyses of futures different, distinct from those of men? Has anyone studied that? And it resulted in a really deep and interesting build out for me of what it is to be a futurist, who's in this arena, how to find people who are not already in the public eye, like Taleb, who's a superstar, best-selling author. And so that it's a way to pop your own balloons sometimes. I find that's very valuable. As I said earlier, use it as a search engine. And Genevieve Gunther is she's not a scientist. She's writing a book about climate terminology. And she's asking these questions about, so why does this amount of CO2 lead to only 3 degrees C of warming? It got some wonderful interaction with scientists. So there's all these opportunities to engage people as using your expertise, not waiting until you have a paper coming out that you want to sort of get around, but sort of being out there on Twitter or on Facebook, frankly, or other media. You're able to start to answer questions people have. One of the most interesting hashtags I thought that evolved at least 6 years ago now was Skype a Scientist. Sarah McNulty, a squid biologist at University of Connecticut, she came up with the idea of, hey, I'm a scientist, I'm working on an interesting question, I'm happy to visit your classroom virtually through, at the time, Skype. This is before Zoom became the big thing it is now. And it was a way as a scientist to sort of put up a little flag saying, here's the work I do. You know, I'd be happy to meet with your students and let's work that out. And then when the pandemic happened, she was already well situated to expand that capacity. And I worked with her, did a couple of webcasts with her, for example. So the hashtags can be used that way. Putting yourself out there can create those opportunities to get interactivity. Well, I mentioned earlier, Twitter data. Twitter can save lives. That's the aspect of it that engineer who just quit, Jim Moffat, works on. How to use the Twitter API, use the flow of data in Twitter to create tools that can save lives actively. And they've done this all around the world. We have scientist Andrew Krushevitz, who at IRI here at Columbia. He's working on a big NASA-funded project on flood warning. I've done several sessions with him, having him work more with, I'd like to do more with him, webcasts on how to build the social media how to use social media effectively in different parts of the world to cut risks. And so those are opportunities that are there for the Columbia community right now.
Holly Everts asked about engineering faculty leaving Twitter for Mastodon and how to handle that.
Mastodon, I'm on Mastodon now. I'll take you there right now. Mastodon is useful. It's compartmentalized. It's a place, to me, it's more like Slack. Like I would ask any of those engineering faculty, what about it gives them a sense of that global potential for connections outside of the community they already know. Even the search function on Mastodon is constrained. You can't search for an open term like coral reefs. You have to use hashtags. And there are other constraints. You can essentially only retweet something. You can re-up it, but you can't add a comment, or you can't sort of retweet with a reply, which I think is very constraining. So it's there. I've got 1,000 followers there now. I just don't see it as having that open aspect that Twitter has that gets you out of your bubble. It's very unidisciplinary. Like the economists are all clustering and the engineers are clustering, and that's great. Everything has a purpose. There are important close focus conversations to have about the work you're doing in engineering for the future of clean water, but to spill that out into the larger world, to talk about how it might be, that work might be applied in Bangladesh, would be much harder to do on Mastodon, for now, at least, than on Twitter. So I think I wouldn't, to me, they're two very different tools. And it's like so many things on the internet. TikTok is an arena I haven't really entered at all. There are people very excited there, including Sam Montano, that emergency management official, professor I talked about earlier, who is starting to dive in there. It's where a lot of eyeballs are. So finding the right mix of the portal methodology and partnerships you would need to be effective toward the goals you have for your science can lead you to TikTok, Twitter, Mastodon, or just writing your work and putting out a press release too. Press releases still matter too. I think they matter less and less, but that's it's all going back to that slide I showed earlier about your goals, your mission, your strategy, your tactics. It really comes down to what you want from what do you want to get done with your work? What's the broader outcomes component of your work? If it's to advance your career in your discipline, that's very different than if you want to have some insight applied on the ground in a place you might not expect where it could be applied. So that's the mix out there.
And just a follow-up question in Holly's comment was not really wanting to join Mastodon because of the self-defined groups, and asking if it's worth waiting to see what happens.
Oh, the other issue we all face is time, opportunity cost. I think I would say it's good to set up an account there like I did. There's no reason not to, and it's more complicated there than on Twitter. You have to find your little, you have to find your I can't remember what they call them. There are different servers. What am I saying? That find the server where you want to hang out, but it doesn't really matter. Some of the servers there have different rules and the like. I chose green, which is mostly European, but just because it was one of the first ones I came across. I don't hang out there a lot. I think it's not worth my time right now to spend a lot of effort there as opposed to on Twitter, where I feel like there's still a lot of work to be done to make it Twitter useful and less harmful, as Amy had expressed the concern about.
And related to that, there's a question about whether or not it makes sense for an entity like Columbia Climate School to have a Mastodon server community.
Oh, to create your own server?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's too soon to waste the time to do that. I think it's a lot of time and not a lot of utility, because there's no real merit for everyone to be on one server. It's just I mean, I'm just saying this as me. I don't have a lot of but I would say, from what I understand of the functionality of Mastodon, I don't see any utility in Columbia or the Climate School having its own server there.
Great. Other questions from people on the webinar?
Let me see I'm going to go to the WADNR account that Lauren mentioned. There's, one organization that has a really good approach to social media is the Wildlife Conservation Society. I get press releases from them where each release has links to their social media, what they put out on Facebook, what they put out on YouTube, what they put out on Twitter. They're very clever with social media and going way back. Okay, so this is Wildlife Conservation Society from the recent, there's COP27, the climate talks, but there's also CITES, the endangered species talks, and coming up the biodiversity talks. So this is Panama calls for major new protection of sharks. But here's their, you see how this is all in the release? High-res images, their news story, their Twitter, their LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. I just think it's a really useful way to think about their news flow, kind of all in one package. And I could forward that email to anyone if they want, just as an example.
Yeah, that's definitely a great example of how to help a journalist out.
Sure.
In the chat, there's a question about what criteria should a school consider and deciding how many separate Twitter accounts to maintain versus an overall account that could have a range of interests that might not be relevant to all subscribers.
Well, this gets to a point that might be uncomfortable for some. I'm not a fan of institutional accounts, although I guess, as Lauren was saying, it sounds like whoever it is who runs the Washington State DNR account, that person is, clever and effective. As I said at the very beginning, remember when I did the search function Twitter is where people are, and sort of institutional accounts I think are good to have, but unless there's someone behind it who's really driving a personal approach, it's not where people would tend to migrate. And or, how do you use an institutional account to enter into a conversation with someone on Twitter? If something was happening related to Greenland's ice sheet and there's a new study out, what you'd want to see in that conversation representing Columbia is a glaciologist more than the Lamont, account, that kind of thing. That's where the trust is. The sense of personality is through interaction with people on Twitter. So Twitter, again, I went through this recently. I'm on the executive committee of the LEAP project, which is a climate modeling center here that Columbia's lead institution on. And there is a LEAP, now there's a LEAP Twitter account, but Pierre Gentine, who's the lead scientist for the group, is active on Twitter. And I, as a journalist, especially a journalist, is out there sifting for people, not for institutions. So that, I think the more that can be done to foster the capacity of people at Columbia, at the climate school, to be active, to be present and engaged on Twitter, the more it will benefit the school than to have, or the particular subsets, subprograms to have accounts. But that's just my thinking.
And in the chat, Tara's noting that an institutional account can loop in an expert into a conversation by tagging them.
Yes, but again, that's fine. But the person who's tagged, you'd want them in the conversation. So it's like Gavin Schmidt, who has been quieter on Twitter lately. He was at NASA. Yes, I could show. I think he's been quieter lately because he's running GIS now. Historically, he was very active, and he's a voice. He's still very active. He hasn't showed up in my feed as much. So it's people again. Twitter's a place for people more than institutions. Ultimately, Catherine Hayhoe obviously is a prime case study in that. Peter Glick, another one out west. So this is just climate of Gavin. This is Gavin's flow. Let's just see. So my answer again is it's people who populate Twitter mostly in a way that's active and engaging. And that's what a journalist would look for. It's people who you build conversations. And, here's Gavin talking about racism and anti-Semitism. So, he's a very personal person. Having training on how to be personal and professional at the same time is another part of what I think would be a good way to build some presence on Twitter that doesn't kick back in ways that you wouldn't want. Let me just see when I'm not missing any other input here. Experts on Twitter can also build on an institutional tweet by quote tweeting and advancing conversation. Yeah, I think, I guess what I'd say is if I had, X amount of dollars or time to spend on running an institutional account versus identifying who across the landscape of the climate school is already on Twitter and might be hesitant or at the point of being more engaged, getting more of a comfort level on them and having them then tag the institution. You're flipping it around so it's more like that. Feels like a better approach than the institution tagging the person. Just in terms of how Twitter functions. Wait, but Tara, it'd be great if Tara could get in the conversation. Everyone wants everything pushed out on social, and some content types did not have an authentic feeling. Conversation starting purpose. Everyone wants everything pushed out on social. Well, that's the question. How much pushing something out on social media, to what end? Always getting the end in mind, is the end. I'm just looking again. She's in the webinar chat. I think I could show that on the screen.
Looks like Tara is now able to speak. Tara, are you able to
Oh,
go
yeah.
off mute? Oh, there.
Oh, I'd love to talk with you.
Oh, yes. Hello, everyone. Yes, I can't help throwing my 2 cents into the works.
Good.
But I certainly understand your point, Andy, and it is a struggle to put forward, meaningful content. Sometimes we're promoting things, and that's also necessary. But obviously, engagement and conversation on topics is the gold. So perhaps, our broader purpose, cross-channel promotion of things, makes us less, of an authentic player and can distract from the substantive content that we want to share.
These are all open questions. I think. I do think one thing I've long wanted to do here is just get the feel for who, across the climate school. Is there a list of folks who are on Twitter, and then a survey with them? I did a survey. I was trying to pull up the visual of it earlier, and I had trouble. We basically have, in the early days of the Sustainability Communications Network, we did a survey, but I think 270 people replied. And there was a breakdown of people who were, but what's your sense of social media? And it was hesitant, from like never to hesitant to hopeful to evangelist. And there's certain cohorts there. And knowing who's there, who's in those cohorts, having them fostering conversations among them, so that the ones who are still super excited can work collaboratively with those who are hesitant but hopeful, to get them a little bit more dipping their toes in, would feel very productive for the long-term outcome for the school generally.
Thank you, Andy. Any other questions or comments that people want to make? We'll give it a minute.
And as I said earlier, I'm very happy to do one-on-ones, or have small group chats with folks anywhere across the landscape here to drive things forward. We could, to explore Mastodon. I could pull in a couple of people. Carl Bergstrom out. Well, there are a few scientists I know. I'm not sure who at Columbia is already there and feeling enthusiastic about it. So Holly, knowing who's there and who's happy would be useful. I could pull them into a conversation, that kind of thing.
Great. Well, with that, Andy, I'm just going to say thank you so much. I think this was a really interesting conversation about the uses of Twitter and other platforms, and how you can use it to your best ability, or advance the messaging you want out as an individual or an organization.